In the summer of 1347, the fields of Suffolk glowed gold beneath a sky that promised nothing but good fortune. The wheat swayed like the tide, heavy with grain, and the smell of earth and hay filled the warm air. To Thomas Carter, a tenant farmer bound to the manor of Lord Ælfric, the season seemed blessed. His sons worked beside him, their backs brown from the sun. His wife, Mary, sang as she tied sheaves in the distance. It was hard labour, but honest, and Thomas believed that in toil lay salvation. Life in the village of Dunhollow had never been easy, but it had always been steady. The peasants worked the demesne fields 3 days each week for their lord, then tended their own narrow strips. The rhythm of seed and harvest, rent and tithe had ruled generations without question. The church bell marked their days, and the seasons marked their lives. In that summer, none could imagine that within 2 years, half the world they knew would lie silent. Thomas was a man of 35, neither poor nor prosperous by peasant measure. He had survived bad winters, failed crops, and the taxes of war. He owed obedience to his lord, coin to the reeve, and confession to God. Yet despite the burdens of serfdom, he counted himself fortunate. He had his land, his family, his oxen, and his faith. What more, he thought, could a man require? But beyond the calm fields of East Anglia, strange rumours were already travelling along the traders' roads, whispers of a pestilence that had devoured towns in distant lands. It was said to have come from the east, riding the caravans that crossed the world. Entire cities had perished, merchants said. The dead lay unburied in the streets. Such tales sounded to the villagers like the stories of Revelation, far from their humble lives. The world beyond England might burn or freeze, but the plough still turned the same soil. That autumn, a merchant from London passed through Dunhollow on his way to Norwich. He stopped at the alehouse, weary and pale. The villagers gathered to hear his news. He spoke of Genoa, of ships fleeing the east filled with dying men. The sailors, he said, bleed from the mouth and groin. They rot before they can speak. The crowd crossed themselves. The priest, Father Edmund, dismissed the tale as heathen nonsense. God punishes sin, not the innocent, he said, and England is under his protection. The villagers wanted to believe him, and for a while they did. The winter came mild and quiet. Snow fell late, and lambing began early. Thomas and his eldest, William, repaired the thatch and mended the ploughshare. Mary brewed ale to sell at market, and the family saved enough coin to dream of buying another pig. Life, it seemed, was moving upward. Then came the spring of 1348. At first it was only a rumour again a ship from Gascony landing at Melcombe Regis, some sailors sick and fevered. But rumour travels faster than truth. Before summer's end the sickness had reached Bristol, and from Bristol the roads led everywhere. The first sign in Dunhollow was a traveller found dead by the roadside, his face blackened and swollen. The bailiff ordered his body buried beyond the village boundary. Father Edmund prayed over the grave, though he kept his distance. The villagers whispered but carried on their work. Death was no stranger to them. Famine and fever visited often. None yet knew this death was unlike any other. A fortnight later, old Nan the washerwoman fell ill. She complained of a pain in her neck, then collapsed beside the well. When Thomas helped carry her into her hut, he saw the dark lumps beneath her arms, hot and hard as stones. Within 2 days, she was gone. The reeve said to burn her bedding, and the smoke drifted through the village like a warning. The next victim was the reeve himself. Panic spread quicker than the plague. Families locked their doors, abandoning neighbours they had known all their lives. The Manor S Hall, once open to petitioners, closed its gates. The Lord retreated with his household, leaving the villagers to fend for themselves. Father Edmund continued to hold Mass, but fewer came each week. Some said the church bell itself carried death in its sound. Thomas watched in silence as fear hollowed the village. He'd seen sickness before, but nothing like this. Those struck down in the morning were dead by nightfall. The swellings burst, leaking foul blood. The air grew thick with the stench of decay. The priest ordered processions and prayers, but soon even he fell ill, gasping for breath as his lips turned blue. Before he died, he whispered that it was God's wrath made flesh. By midsummer, half of Dunhollow lay empty. Fields went untilled, livestock wandered free, and the lanes were silent except for the caw of crows. Thomas buried his youngest daughter Alice himself. She'd woken one dawn shivering, and by dusk she was gone. He dug the grave on the edge of the field where she used to gather wildflowers. No priest, no blessing, only the wind and his tears. Mary knelt beside him, her hands trembling. "Is it the end of the world?" she asked. Thomas had no answer. He began to notice strange things. The air felt heavy as if poisoned. Dogs refused to eat the dead. Men fled to the woods, hoping the trees might hide them from God's anger. Some said the Jews had cursed the wells. Others blamed comets or bad air rising from the earth. There were no answers, only the tally of the dead. Then, as suddenly as it had come, the plague seemed to pass. The chill of autumn slowed the sickness, and for a few weeks there was peace. Survivors emerged from their huts, blinking at the pale sun. They gathered in the square, silent, unsure if they should rejoice or mourn. Thomas counted his blessings. His wife and 2 sons still lived. But the village was a shadow of itself. Out of 100 souls, barely 40 remained. The manorous fields lay wild. The church door hung open to the wind. When a band of strangers arrived seeking shelter, pilgrims, they said, fleeing from the west, Thomas saw in them the reflection of his own fear. They carried nothing but rags and faith. One among them, a thin man with hollow eyes, told of towns where the dead outnumbered the living. "There are no bells left to toll," he said, "only silence." Thomas listened, and something hardened within him. He understood then that survival would not come from prayer alone. It would come from the stubborn will to live, from the work of hands and the strength of heart. The world was changing, and he must change with it. As the year waned, he gathered what remained of his neighbours. Together they harvested what grain they could, and stored it in the Lord's barn, though no Lord remained to claim it. Hunger and cold would soon test them as cruelly as plague had done. But Thomas, once an obedient serf, began to lead. The old order had vanished. Only those who acted would endure. The Black Death had not finished its work. It would return with the spring, but already it had sown the seeds of a new world. And Thomas Carter, peasant of Dunhollow, had taken his first step into that terrible, uncertain dawn. The winter of 1348 descended grey and pitiless over Dunhollow. The frost came early, sheathing the bare branches in white glass. The air stung like iron. Smoke from the few surviving hearths rose in thin, wavering threads above the ruined village. What had once been a hum of life, the cry of children, the clatter of carts, the tolling of the bell, was now a ghostly silence, broken only by the creak of frozen wood. Thomas Carter stood at the edge of his field, wrapped in a rough wool cloak stiff with frost. The stubble of the last harvest poked through the snow. Crows hopped among it, black shapes against the white. The manor house stood dark in the distance, its gates chained and windows shuttered. Lord Elfric and his family had fled months ago, and no word had come since. The old world had ended quietly, without proclamation or trumpet. The laws that had bound men to land and lord had dissolved with the bodies of their masters. Now there was only survival. Thomas's wife, Mary, spent her days tending what food they had left. The barley stores were low, the salted meat was long gone. The boys, William, now 17, and young John, 12, snared rabbits and scavenged for roots in the frozen woods. Hunger gnawed at them all, but still they lived. The dead, too many to bury before the frost, lay beneath the snow in shallow pits. The villagers no longer spoke of them. Grief had become a luxury. They gathered what they could salvage from the abandoned cottages, blankets, tools, grain. None called it theft. There was no reeve, no bailiff, no priest to forbid it. Only the living and the dead who would not need such things again. In January, a band of men came from the south, rough travellers with hollow eyes. They wore torn cloaks and carried cudgels. Their leader, a scarred man with a rusted sword, demanded food and shelter. "By right of need," he said. Thomas, wary but desperate for allies, offered them a place in the old tithe barn. For a time they worked together, repairing fences, hunting, watching the roads. But hunger breeds greed. One night, when snow fell thick and silent, the strangers tried to take more than food. They forced their way into Thomas's cottage, demanding his stores. William met them at the door with a wood axe. The fight was brief, savage, wordless. When it was done, 2 of the strangers lay bleeding in the snow. The rest fled into the dark. Thomas buried the bodies in the frozen earth. He did not tell the boys to pray. He had seen too much to believe that prayers alone could hold back death. The weeks passed in a weary sameness. Each dawn brought the same pale light, the same thin smoke rising from the few remaining chimneys. The survivors of Dun Hollow, barely 24 souls, met often in the square, seeking comfort in one another's faces. Widow Agnes, who'd lost her entire family, spoke of leaving for Norwich, where she'd heard the plague had passed. Others muttered that travel meant death, that the roads were haunted by thieves and corpses. Thomas said little. He knew the sickness still lingered, waiting for the thaw. The rats had grown bold again, skittering through the granary, gnawing at the edges of the new world. When spring finally broke, the earth revealed its dead. The snow melted, and with it came the smell, the thick, sweet stench of rot. Thomas and the villagers burned what bodies they could, though wood was scarce. Smoke drifted across the valley for days, black against the pale sky. The plague had not vanished. It had only slept. In nearby villages, travellers said the sickness had returned. Thomas gathered the survivors. "We'll plant," he said. "If we starve workin'." They broke the soil with hands blistered and raw. The land lay rich and dark beneath the frost, hungry for seed. With so few to labour, each furrow was an act of defiance. Mary, thin but resolute, boiled nettles and weeds for supper. "It is God's test," she said. Thomas no longer knew if he believed her, but he found strength in her calm. Then came a sight he would never forget. One morning, as mist lifted from the fields, a procession appeared on the southern road, men in white robes, their backs bloody from scourging. They chanted as they walked, voices low and mournful. "Miserere nobis, Domine have mercy on us, O Lord." They called themselves the Flagellants. Believing the plague was God, as punishment for the sins of mankind, they travelled from town to town, whipping themselves to atone for all. The villagers watched in silence as the procession passed. The air smelled of sweat and iron. A gaunt man at the head of the group raised a wooden cross. "Repent," he cried. "Repent and be saved. The end is near." Some of Dunhollow's folk fell to their knees. Others turned away in fear. Thomas saw in the men's hollow eyes a madness born of despair. When they left, he felt the silence close like a door behind them. By midsummer, the harvest stood thin but green. The village, though scarred, had endured. Yet the world beyond was still burning. Messengers came from Norwich bearing grim tidings. The plague had reached London. The capital, they said, was a place of horror streets filled with carts of the dead, houses sealed by order of the mayor. The bells toll all day and night, one man said. The river carries corpses like driftwood. The villagers listened, wide-eyed, as if he spoke of a different world. In truth, the sickness was already upon them again. It began with William. He had been helping in the fields when he complained of a fever. By evening his neck was swollen, his breath shallow. Mary knelt beside him through the night, her hands trembling as she prayed. Thomas sat by the door, staring into the dark, hearing the boy's laboured breathing. By dawn, the buboes had risen beneath William's arms, black and glistening. Thomas knew there was nothing to be done. The boy's eyes rolled back, and he gasped one final breath. Thomas buried him beside little Alice in the same field where the flowers grew. He worked in silence, his face expressionless, his heart a stone. Mary did not speak for 3 days. When she finally rose, her hair unbound, she whispered, "We are cursed." Thomas said nothing. He could not deny it. The sickness took others in the weeks that followed. Widow Agnes, the miller's boy, old Ewan the shepherd. Each death seemed to hollow the village further, like the slow rot of wood. Thomas began to dream of silence, vast, empty silence over the land, as if even the wind had died. Yet he lived. Mary lived. Young John, thin and frightened, clung to them both. The plague passed once more as summer faded. Dunhollow was now a ruin, its cottages half collapsed, its lanes overgrown. Where once 100 souls had worked the fields, barely a dozen remained. And with death came a strange freedom. There were no lords left to demand rent, no reeve to collect dues. The manor's barn stood full of grain, its lands empty and rich. For the first time in his life, Thomas was not bound. He could take what he needed, sow where he wished. The feudal world that had chained him since birth was gone, but freedom meant little to a man who had lost nearly everything. In the autumn of 1349, a lone horseman rode into Dunhollow. He wore the livery of Lord Aelfric, but bore a new seal on his chest, the royal arms of King Edward. He spoke with authority, demanding account of the Manor-s tenants. Thomas and the others gathered to hear him. "The plague has thinned our kingdom," the man said, "but the king decrees that all who can work must do so, for the good of England. No man shall demand higher wages than before the pestilence, nor refuse his lord a service." Thomas stared at him. "What lord?" he asked. The messenger frowned. "Your Lord Aelfric, by the king's grant." "He is dead," said Thomas. "We buried his steward last winter. No man has ruled here since." The messengeress' face hardened. "Then you shall obey the crown. The king will not have peasants grow proud." Thomas felt a spark of anger rise in him, the first he had known in months. "We have buried our dead, tilled the fields, and fed ourselves without lord or crown," he said. "If the king wishes obedience, let him come and plough beside us." The messenger raised his whip, but seeing the hollow-eyed men behind Thomas, gaunt from hunger yet unafraid, he thought better of it. He turned his horse and rode away, his cloak snapping in the wind. That night, around the fire, Thomas told his wife, "They think the world will go on as before. They are wrong. The old order is buried with the dead." Mary stared into the flames. And what will rise in its place? Thomas did not know. The year ended in uneasy peace. The survivors of Dunhollow gathered their harvest, small but enough to live. The church bell, long silent, was melted down for metal. The fields grew quiet again, but now it was a different kind of silence, one of endurance, not despair. Thomas stood once more at the edge of his land, looking over the frost-bound soil. He thought of those who had gone, his children, his lord, his neighbours, and of those who remained. In the distance the first snow began to fall. He was no longer a serf, no longer bound to any man. He was something new, something born from the ashes of the plague, a survivor. The spring of 1350 came soft and green over England, as if the earth itself had forgotten the horror it had buried. Grass grew thick over the graves. Wildflowers burst through the thatch of abandoned cottages. The silence that had once smothered Dunhollow now felt gentler, a stillness after the storm. Thomas Carter rose before dawn each day, the same as always. Habit was the last tether to the world he'd known. He ploughed the fields beside his surviving son John, whose hands had grown rough and sure far sooner than they should have. Mary tended the garden, her face thin but her eyes clear again. The three of them worked and lived as if no one else in the world remained. Yet beyond their valley, England was stirring. Rumours came down the road like ghosts of the dead world, that the king had lost half his court, that London was half empty, that labourers were fleeing their masters and demanding wages. In the north, they said, villages had vanished altogether. Monasteries stood hollow, their bells rusting silent in their towers, and still the living endured. By midsummer, travellers once again crossed the countryside, tinkers, pilgrims and beggars drawn by hunger or hope. Some came to Dunhollow, asking for food, news, a bed of straw for the night. Thomas fed them when he could. Their tales painted a picture stranger than any dream. One man, a mason from Canterbury, told of whole manors deserted, where sheep roamed through fields untended and crops grew wild. "There's work enough for any man with hands," he said. "Lords are begging for labour, but no one will work without coin. They can hang us all." Thomas listened in silence. He had spent his life bound to a lord's will, ploughing for another's gain. Now the balance of the world seemed to tilt. Men like him, once the lowest of the low, held a power no king could ignore. Mary saw it too. "It's the Lord's judgment," she said one night, staring into the hearth's dull glow. "He swept away the proud and lifted up the humble." Thomas didn't answer, but he wondered. Was this judgment or chance? When a band of merchants came through on their way to Norwich, they spoke of something stranger still. "The Pope in Avignon has called for days of fasting," one said. "He says we must purify the air with fire and prayer." Another added that some towns had taken to burning incense and ringing bells to drive away the miasma. "It does no good," he said grimly. "The pestilence chooses whom it will." Thomas felt the old fear stir again. The plague had passed twice through Dunhollow. Could it come again? Yet the year rolled on, warm and bright, and no new sickness came. For the first time since the world had ended, Thomas began to think beyond survival. The manor land stretched wide and rich around Dunhollow, lying fallow for want of hands. Thomas saw opportunity there. He gathered the remaining villagers, a dozen souls at most, and proposed they claim the land together. "We'll sow it and reap it as our own," he said. "No reeve, no lord, we've earned it." There was murmuring, fear of sin and punishment, but hunger outweighed hesitation. They began to divide the fields. Men who had once doffed their caps to the manor now marked their own boundaries with stones. That summer, as harvest was meagre, but it was theirs. When they sat to eat, bread rough and hard but earned by their own hands, Thomas felt a pride he had never known. The plague had taken his children, his neighbours, his lord, but it had given him freedom. Yet freedom carried its own peril. In August, soldiers came riding down from Norwich, 5 men in mail, their horses snorting clouds of dust. Their leader, a knight with a face as pale as steel, demanded to see the reeve. "There is none," Thomas said. "Then by order of his majesty you will pay the king's due. These lands belong to the crown until rightful heirs are named." Thomas looked at the others. No one spoke. "We have nothing," he said finally. "No coin, no master. Only our hands and our grain." The knight's eyes narrowed. "Then your grain shall serve." They took half the harvest. Thomas watched in silence as the carts rolled away. When the soldiers were gone, Mary touched his arm. "You should have stopped them." "With what?" he said. "An axe? They'd hang me." But even as he spoke, he knew something had changed. The fear that had once ruled him was gone. In its place was a cold resolve. That autumn, Thomas left Dunhollow for the first time in 2 years. He set out for Norwich to see what had become of the wider world. The road was lined with ruins. Villages lay half collapsed, their timbers grey with weather. In one he found a church whose door had been nailed shut from within. When he pried it open, the pews were filled with bones. No one had come to bury them. Further along he met other travellers, men and women wandering in search of work, food, or merely company. Some spoke of miracle springs that healed the sick, others of devils walking by night. The line between faith and fear had thinned until one was scarcely different from the other. In Norwich he found a city changed beyond knowing. The streets were overgrown with weeds, the markets half empty. Yet life pulsed stubbornly through the cracks. Bakers sold bread at high prices, carpenters shouted for apprentices, and the churchyards teemed with the newly dead. He heard talk of the king's new law, the statute of labourers, meant to bind men again to their old wages. "They would chain us to the grave," a young mason said bitterly. "But we've seen death, and we don't fear it any more." Thomas stayed the night in an alehouse crowded with wanderers. He listened as they spoke of rebellion in hushed tones. "If the Lord's won to pay fair, we'll leave the fields to rot," said one. "Let them plough their own soil." He thought of Dunhollow, of the hands that still trembled when a soldier passed, and wondered how long such silence could last. When he returned home, Mary greeted him with tears. "I feared you. Gone forever." "I've seen what's left of England," he said. "The old world's bones picked clean. They work through another harvest, smaller now, but steadier." Life crept back into Dunhollow like green shoots through ash. Children's laughter began to echo again, thin, uncertain, but alive. And yet, beneath it all, Thomas felt the shadow still linger. The plague had withdrawn, but not forever. He sensed it waiting, somewhere beyond the horizon. That winter, a stranger came to the village, a friar, thin as a reed, with eyes that burned fever bright. He preached in the square, calling the plague a cleansing fire. "God has burned the world to its roots," he said, "that it might grow pure again. Those who survive must build his kingdom anew." Some villagers knelt to listen, others turned away. Thomas asked him quietly, "And if we build it, will he spare us next time?" The friar smiled, sad and knowing. No one is spared forever, but he sees the hearts of those who endure. When the friar left, Thomas watched him vanish down the road and wondered if endurance alone could ever be enough. The years that followed blurred together. Seasons came and went. Crops rose and fell. Dunhollow slowly filled again, not with its old faces, but with new ones, strangers seeking refuge, widows from other towns, orphans grown to labourers. The land healed, and so did the people. Yet no man forgot the silence of those years. It lived in them, a quiet scar beneath every laugh and song. By 1353, talk reached the village of new taxes, new wars, new laws from London. The king, they said, needed silver to rebuild his realm. But the peasants, hardened by loss, muttered in their fields. They had seen what power looked like when it failed to protect them. One night, sitting beside the fire, Thomas told his son, "The world will never be what it was. Remember that. When you see the Lauder's men come with their scrolls and their seals, remember who kept this land alive when they ran." John nodded. "I will, father." Thomas looked into the flames. Then perhaps the plague did have a purpose. For though death had claimed half of England, it had given the rest something no law could bind, again the memory of freedom, bought dearly with suffering. The Black Death had stripped away the illusion of order. In its wake, men like Thomas had learned the hardest truth, that the world endures not through kings or priests, but through the quiet, stubborn labour of those who refuse to die. By 1355, England was breathing again, but it was not the same breath. The land was green, the fields heavy with grain, yet there was a new unease in the air, like the stillness before a storm. In Dunhollow, Thomas Carter was an older man now, his beard grey at the edges, his hands calloused from decades of ploughing. His son John had grown tall and broad-shouldered, a man in his own right, with a wife and an infant daughter. The village, once a ruin of ash and silence, had found its voice again, hammers ringing from the smithy, oxen lowing in the fields, laughter echoing faintly from the cottages. But with life came authority, creeping back like ivy over stone. The new lord of the manor, Sir Geoffrey Elfric, nephew to the one who had fled and died, arrived one bright spring morning with soldiers at his side. His banner, red and gold, snapped in the wind. He rode through the lanes with the air of a man reclaiming what was his by birthright. Thomas watched from the edge of his field, scythe in hand, as the Lordis men inspected the lands the villagers had worked for nearly a decade without master or rent. Sir Geoffrey dismounted at the square. "By writ of His Majesty the King," he declared, "these lands are mine by inheritance and grace. All tenants shall pay rent as before and return to their due service. Let none defy royal law." The villagers stood silent. They had buried too many masters to fear another. At last Thomas stepped forward. "We kept this land alive when no lord or reeve remained," he said. "We sowed it, we reaped it, we fed our children while your kind hid behind stone walls. Now you come to take what you did not earn?" Sir Geoffrey's gaze hardened. "You speak treason, peasant." "I speak truth," Thomas said. "If that be treason, then England is full of traitors." There was a long silence. The soldiers shifted uneasily. The lord studied Thomas's face, then turned his horse. "You will pay your rents, or the king's justice will remind you of your place." When they were gone, Mary touched her husband's arm. "You should not have spoken." "I've spent my life silent," Thomas said. "No more." That summer, the tax collectors came thin men with ink-stained fingers and sharp eyes. They brought scrolls sealed with the royal mark, demanding coin for the king's wars in France. Few in Dunhollow had coin to give. They offered grain, hides, labour, but the collectors wanted silver. When Thomas refused, they seized one of his oxen. He watched them lead it away without a word, but his eyes burned like embers. In Norwich and beyond, he heard, such scenes were common. The plague had broken the Lord's strength, but not their greed. They wanted the world rebuilt as it was before, as though half of England had not died to change it. But change had taken root in the hearts of men. In the taverns of Norwich, murmurs grew louder. They can to force us to serve, labourers said. There are more fields than men. Let the lords plough their own. Word spread of villages, defying their masters, of men refusing the old dues, of priests preaching that all souls were equal before God. Thomas felt it too, a rising defiance, slow and dangerous as fire beneath dry straw. One evening, when the sun sank red over the fields, John returned from market with news. There is talk in every town, he said. The king's men can to find enough workers. They threaten the lash, but men just walk away. They say the law can to chain hunger or pride. Thomas nodded slowly. The world's turning, lad. But the Lord's won't let it turn easy. Years passed, and the tension grew. The plague had left fewer mouths to feed, but also fewer hands to work. Labour was precious now. Men like Thomas could bargain for wages their fathers would never have dreamed of, but each gain was met with new laws to hold them down. Then came the summons. In 1360, a royal messenger arrived in Dunhollow demanding men for the army. England, weary but unbroken, was still at war with France. Every able man was called to fight for the crown. Thomas was too old, John was not. Mary wept as her son packed his few belongings, a worn tunic, a knife, a small wooden cross. "You've ploughed this land since you could walk," she said. "Why must you fight for a king who never saw your face?" "Because they'll hang me if I done tea," John said, "and because maybe if I serve, they'll leave us in peace." Thomas gripped his son's shoulder. "You owe them nothing, but come back alive, whatever it takes." John left with the others, marching down the road in a thin column of men who had already given too much to death. The village watched until they vanished into the trees. He returned 3 years later scarred, thinner, his eyes older than his years. He had seen the battlefields of Calais, the corpses piled like firewood, the banners soaked in blood. "War's just another plague," he said quietly one night. "Only slower." Thomas saw the truth in that. The world had survived pestilence, but man's hunger for power endured untouched. By the time the decade turned, Thomas was an old man. His hair had gone white, his back bent with the weight of years, yet he worked still, his hands sure on the plough, his eyes sharp on the furrows. Then came word of a new decree, the poll tax of 1377. Every man and woman, rich or poor, must pay. It was the king's final grasp to rebuild the treasury bled dry by war. In the alehouses, men spat at the mention of it. "We kept this realm alive while they hid behind walls," they said. "Now they call us their subjects again." When the collectors came to Dunhollow, demanding coin from even the poorest widow, the air itself seemed to crackle with rage. Thomas stood in the square, leaning on his staff, watching as the villagers argued. He could feel the storm gathering, the same quiet, patient anger he had carried for 30 years. That night John came to him. "They are rising," he said. "In Kent, in Essex, men are taking up staves and marching on London. They call it the Commons, cause." Thomas looked at the dark sky. It was bound to come. "Will you come with us?" Thomas smiled sadly. "No, lad. My fighting-'s done. I've buried enough of the world already. But go, if you must. Make them hear you." John left before dawn, joining the tide of peasants marching toward the capital. They carried no banners of nobility, only crude staves and scythes, and the memory of hunger and graves. Days later, news came like thunder on the wind. London had fallen to the rebels. The king himself, young Richard II, had met them at Smithfield. Promises were made: freedom, fair wages, justice, and then betrayal. Their leader, Wat Tyler, cut down before the king's eyes. The army scattered. The rebellion ended in blood. John returned weeks later, his face hollow with exhaustion and disbelief. "They killed him," he said, "and the king's men are hanging rebels by the hundreds." Thomas listened in silence. He had known it would come to this. The old order never died quietly. Still, something had changed. The lords could hang men, burn villages, write laws, but they could not unlearn what the plague had taught them all: that death makes equals of kings and peasants alike. In the twilight of his life, Thomas sat often by the field's edge, watching the wind ripple through the wheat. He thought of the years behind him, the summer before the sickness, the silence that followed, the rebirth of the world. Mary, frail but smiling, sat beside him. "Do you ever think it will come again?" she asked. "The plague," he said. She nodded. He looked at the horizon, where the sky met the earth in a haze of gold. "Aye," he said, "but we'll outlast it again. We always do." He reached down, let the soil run through his fingers. It was the same earth he had tilled as a boy, the same soil that had buried his children and grown his grain. It had seen death, and still it lived, and so did he. The year was 1381, and though the rebellion had failed, the ground itself seemed to hum with change. England was weary, battered by plague, war, and hunger, but beneath the weariness ran a quiet, stubborn pulse. In Dunhollow the fields rippled green again. The scars of death had long been covered by the work of human hands. Cottages had been rebuilt. Children's laughter, rare for so many years, rang again across the lanes. Thomas Carter, now near 70, could still walk the fields when the mornings were cool and the air smelled of damp earth. The plough had long passed to his son John, and John's own children were growing strong, chasing geese through the same furrows their grandfather once turned. But the world they inherited was not the same one Thomas had been born into. In his youth, a man had been bound to the land like a tree to its roots. His lord's permission was needed to marry, to move, even to dream. Yet now, everywhere he looked, that order had cracked. Men spoke of wages, not dues. Peasants moved to towns, sought work in cities, bargained for labour. Some wore cloth finer than their masters had worn 50 years before, and though the lords still called them serfs, the word had lost its teeth. Thomas would sit by the hearth at night, his youngest granddaughter on his knee, and tell her of the days before the pestilence. She listened wide-eyed, as though hearing a tale from another world. There were so many people, he told her once, fields full of men and women laughing, shouting. The fairs were endless music, colours, the smell of roast meat in the air. Then, one summer, the carts came. Not with goods, but with bodies. The child shivered. "Were you afraid, grandfather?" Thomas smiled faintly. "Aye, we all were. But fear passes. The land remains. We learn to live again, one day at a time." When he walked through the churchyard now, he sometimes paused before the old pit at the edge of the village, where the dead of 1349 had been thrown when there were too many to bury properly. The grass grew thick and sweet there now, dotted with wild flowers. No marker, no names, only the memory of what had been. He would stand in silence, hat in hand, and whisper a few words, not prayer exactly, but gratitude. Without those who had perished, there would have been no new world. The priest, a younger man than Thomas, often found him there. "You come here often," Father Anselm said once. "Do you still grieve?" Thomas shook his head. "Not grieve. Remember, the dead built what we have now. Seems wrong to forget that." The priest nodded. "The plague was God's judgment, they say. But perhaps it was also his plough breaking the old soil so something new might grow." Thomas smiled. "A hard plough, then." In the years that followed the rising, the king's men hunted rebels, burned villages, and hung hundreds. Yet even as the gallows filled, something irreversible was happening in the quiet corners of England. The statute of labourers, once enforced with iron, began to crumble. There were too few men to work and too much land to be left fallow. The lords found they needed the peasants as much as the peasants had once needed them. Villages like Dunhollow began to buy their freedom slowly, painfully, one coin at a time. By the end of that century, men who'd been born in bondage were signing contracts, hiring servants, sending sons to schools. It didn't happen overnight, but like the turning of the seasons, it came. And Thomas lived long enough to see its beginning. In the spring of 1385, he sat outside his cottage, the sun warm on his face, the air filled with the scent of wild thyme and smoke. John was mending a harness nearby, his son Henry helping with the leather. Mary, frail but smiling, was spinning thread in the doorway. "Strange, isn't it?" Thomas said after a while. "When I was your age, John, I thought I should die in service to a lord. Never dreamed I'd see my name on a deed." John looked up. "Aye, but it's yours now, all of it." Thomas nodded slowly. "Not mine alone, ours. The land remembers who tended it." He gazed across the fields golden in the light of evening and thought of the faces buried beneath them. Friends, neighbours, children lost. He could almost hear their laughter carried on the wind. That night, as the stars came out, Thomas lay awake beside Mary, listening to the night sounds, the distant call of an owl, the whisper of leaves outside. He thought of how many nights he had survived, nights of fever, of hunger, of silence. He turned to Mary. "Do you think they were at peace, the ones we lost?" She reached for his hand. "They must be. The world they left behind finally learned to live." He smiled faintly, feeling the warmth of her fingers. "Aye," he murmured. "We did, didn't we?" He passed quietly before dawn, with the birds just beginning to stir in the hedges. Mary found him still and peaceful, his face turned toward the window where the first light touched his brow. They buried him on the hill overlooking the fields he had worked all his life. The priest spoke of faith and endurance, of the humble man who had seen England through its darkest hour. But the villagers needed no sermon to know what Thomas Carter had meant. His life was their story, the story of all who had survived when survival seemed impossible. Years later, when the memory of the plague had become legend, the children of Dunhollow would play on that same hill. Sometimes, when the wind shifted through the grass, they said they could hear the echo of an old man's voice. The land remains, the land remembers, and perhaps it did. For the earth that had devoured the dead also nourished the living. From the ashes of pestilence, a New England had risen, one where a ploughman could own his field, where a child born to toil could dream of freedom. No one man could claim to have shaped that change. It was born of grief, of endurance, of the simple will to live. But if one life could stand for them all, then let it be. His, Thomas Carter, peasant of Dunhollow, survivor of the Black Death. He had no title, no wealth, no monument of stone. Yet his legacy was carved into the furrows of every English field, written in the very breath of those who came after. The Black Death had sought to end the world. Instead, it remade it. And through plague and hunger, fire and fear, the peasants endured. They lived. And by living, they changed history.